Edward James was not a member of the Surrealist movement, but he has left the most extraordinary legacy of Surrealism. He was very, very close to the artists that he supported, and he thought of himself not just as a patron, but as somebody who was intimately involved. He invented objects, he invented interiors, and he invented all kinds of strange things.
If I'm a surrealist, it's not because I got linked with a movement, it's because I was born one. A great number of people are surrealists without ever having heard of the movement. But it is people who were close to their subconscious. The world is not completely logical all the time. They make the illogical logical, and they make it more vivid than life, in a way that dreams can sometimes be more vivid than actuality.
There were echoes of his childhood that clearly haunted him when he was grown up. He talks about the memories that he has when he hears tissue paper rustling. He's transported back to his childhood as a little boy watching his sister pack ball gowns into a suitcase. He has very, very sharp memories, even if his childhood was probably quite lonely.
I was made to sleep in my perambulator, and I couldn't sleep. Also, I wasn't allowed up in the morning. I remember in Scotland on a wonderful fine day in August, and the sun pouring through the blinds at 7. I wanted to get out of my little bed, which I was hemmed in by big brass rails, and run out into the garden and down to the beach. But I wasn't allowed to until Nanny woke up, which wasn't until 8:30. So I would have from 7 till 8:30, in which I'd have to invent a world, and therefore all my blankets became a flying city, and I made domes out of the pillows, and I would get under and imagine that I was in a series of halls, and this was Aladdin's palace flying over the world.
Edward James came into contact with Surrealism through the very major aristocratic patrons in Paris, the Vicomte and Vicomtesse de Noailles. Charles de Noailles had funded the two great Surrealist films by Buñuel and Dali, An Andalusian Dog and L'Âge d'Or, and through them the Surrealists met above all Salvador Dali. Edward became very close to Salvador Dali and Gala in about 1935. He kept a very close eye on Dali and eventually signed a contract with him to purchase his entire production for 1 year. He thereby amassed one of the greatest collections of paintings by Dali in the world. There are quite a lot of portraits of James. Magritte's are the most outstanding. Magritte, thought of Edward as a sort of active sounding board on which he could try out various extraordinary thoughts he had for paintings. He was regarded by Edward as, a quite exceptional genius, both Magritte and Dali, of course, and it was really Edward's gift to have found them and to have supported them at a crucial time in their careers. I think it's true to say that Edward had a much greater role in the creation of the Surrealist objects for which Dali is so famous. There is a story that a little group of people were eating lobsters, gathered round James's bed, and they were throwing the lobster shells about, and one landed by chance on a telephone. And then perhaps it was Edward, perhaps it was Dali. He said, look, there's a Surrealist object. And the actual fabrication of these objects then was up to Edward. He was extraordinarily imaginative and inventive in the interiors that he created at Monckton House and at West Dean.
So here we are in the Tower Suite, which is one of the rooms at West Dean that most reflects his interior style. He was responsible for the design of this space in the late 1940s. So the drapes in the room date from then, as does the window treatment and various other things. And so what we see in terms of the objects and paintings around the space is an eclectic mix of some of the most fabulously significant Surrealist works.
In Edward's collection of paintings, there are an extraordinary number of works by female artists. And he was very close to a number of the women artists who were linked to Surrealism or who were Surrealists. The position of the women artists in Surrealism was notoriously difficult. To an extent, they were encouraged, but there was always a little bit of a sense that they were preferred as lovers or as muses, supporting the work of their spouses or their partners. They had to separate themselves a little bit from the movement in order to establish themselves as artists.
I wear 2 socks and 2 shoes. One foot is turning into a cloven hoof and the other into a parrot's claw.
Besides attesting but lasting friendship, Leonora shares Edward's love of cautionary verse.
It was called, what was it called? One about the Frigidaire. Do you remember?
Well, I remember the one about...
When babies' cries were hard to bear, they popped him in the Frigidaire.
Yeah, that was...
In the period after the war, he began to travel a great deal in Mexico. He was very, very interested in plants and in animals. He met somebody who said, well, there's a most extraordinary microclimate valley where there are orchids growing in abundance on the trees. And so Edward went to see this place and fell in love with it immediately. Eventually he bought it and started to create his extraordinary Surrealist sculpture garden.
All creative people work from their subconscious outwards, and intellectuals work from their intellect inwards, you see. I'm not an intellectual at all. In fact, most intellectuals resent me. They all realize I'm not one of them, and it's quite nasty. To them, I'm a sort of an overgrown child. And I always try, and now that I'm old, saying I'm in my second childhood, you must excuse me. But of course, that's not strictly true, because I've never grown out of my first childhood.
I think he always thought of himself, or wanted to be thought of, as a poet. But I think he also left a legacy in Westdean itself, because he managed to basically save the house and turn this great estate into Westdean College. He turned out to have been an incredibly thoughtful preserver of extraordinarily beautiful piece of West Sussex.